It's time again for another installment of The Basics, and on today's show, in regards to the Star Trek CCG, I want to talk about affiliations that play well together, meaning two affiliations that you can pair in a deck. And just so everyone knows, I'm not getting into the details of treaty cards or espionage. I'm just talking about two affiliations that work well together, especially in a deck. Let's get started, shall we? Now, some of these might seem like no-brainers to a lot of you, especially if you've been playing the Star Trek CCG for a long time or since the beginning in 1994. But they do work. I have tested all of them out. I don't keep a lot of dual affiliation decks right now. I believe I only have one, but I do experiment from time to time. So let's start with the obvious, and that is the pairing of Klingons and Romulans. Both personnel across the affiliations have either treachery or honor or both. They're great at navigation. There's a lot of staff with command icons. And whether you're using the Klingon or Romulan or both together, you'll notice that cloaked ships, extra technology, and a great selection of weapons. So again, this is a no-brainer. To pair these two together is a plus if you're making that kind of a deck. You just have to be wary of some of the espionage cards as well as some of the support cards for each affiliation. Dominion and Cardassian, also a no-brainer. Anyone who's familiar with Deep Space Nine as a series know that these two work well together, especially if you're building a deck that's heavy on founders, but you want to add some punch and a lot of extra attributes. You add in your Cardassian, Keldon-class vessels, and Cardassians have a lot of intricate personnel in their affiliation, like Kotran Padar, any of the versions of Elim Garrick, Dukat, Damar, etc. It goes on and on. They complement each other nicely. And there's a lot you can do with a deck that has both of these affiliations in it. There's somebody in the Star Trek group that I'm in that's actually building a Cardassian Dominion deck right now. I've personally experimented with it. The only detractor is you need a rather large deck compared to others, especially if you're using a Q's Tent side deck to go with this. You need a lot of cards to make it work. Lesser known one, because you don't see a lot of people make Delta Quadrant decks, and if they do, it's usually Federation with a smattering of non-aligned. But a Kazon/non-aligned deck works extremely well, because a lot of the Delta Quadrant non-aligned cards, especially personnel, have a lot of good attributes. And there are some pretty cool ships in there as well, not to mention some of the bigger Kazon ships. So this is a worthwhile deck to be put together. And there are also some of those few missions in Delta Quadrant that utilize both Kazon and non-aligned affiliations. So this is actually a win-win. Kazon by itself is kind of wimpy. I've explained this before in previous episodes. But you get a bigger punch when you put non-aligned cards with them. That notwithstanding, non-aligned usually goes well with a lot of different affiliations, but it works exceptionally well with Kazon. Federation and Bajoran, huge no-brainer. Again, this is through Deep Space Nine, but if you combine a lot of the high attribute Bajoran personnel and put them on powerful Federation ships and outposts, like Deep Space Nine, which is actually a Bajoran outpost, but staff it with Federation personnel and technology, as well as enough sight cards, and you have a pretty damn good outpost. It's a very high-powered deck. I've experimented with it once. I won a game rather quickly, but then I ended up losing a game because someone else's Borg deck did me in. That's the only downfall to Bajoran. They can't do shit against Borg. But against any other affiliation, when combined with the Federation, they have a really good chance. And it's a very intricate, awesome deck. Throw in Kira Nerys and Odo into that deck with your, let's say, DS9 or Next Generation Bridge Crew, and you have a pretty damn good deck. Ferengi and Non-Aligned. This is, in my books, a no-brainer, mainly because I have a Ferengi deck built that has a smattering of non-aligned personnel thrown in. As awesome as the Ferengi are in terms of personal attributes, and their ships are pretty cool right out of the gate, when you add in some non-aligned personnel that have, say, extra treachery, or in this case with Liam Bilby, you have Orion Syndicate on his card, as well as honor and leadership, that helps out any Ferengi deck. And One of the things you need to add to a Ferengi deck is personnel that have medical and science. And a lot of the non-aligned personnel are very good with medical and science as either primary or secondary attributes, which complements the Ferengi beautifully. You don't necessarily need non-aligned ships in this deck, but the personnel will make your Ferengi deck hard to beat. And finally, the most obvious combo in the game, which really needs no explanation, is Klingon and Federation. They complement each other so well, and especially if you throw in the Defiant with its cloaking device and a couple birds of prey, wow, or even a Vorcha. Now normally you'd wonder why I barely mention the Negvar. I like the Negvar, but it's easier to get birds of prey moving down the space line quicker than it is a Negvar due to the staffing requirements. And add the Defiant in the mix, as well as some top level personnel on both sides of the affiliation. Wow. Kind of hard to deal with that deck, and I've seen it go down many times. Now, you've noticed I've left out a few affiliations, and I'm going to explain why. The first being Vidian. Yes, you can pair some non-aligned with Vidian, but Vidian is one of, if not the weakest affiliations in the game. I don't even bother with it. I've thought about making a Vidian deck with non-aligned personnel, but I can't be bothered. Hirogen, they don't play well with anybody, and you can try putting non-aligned personnel in that deck. I prefer leaving Hirogen alone as is. Their attributes and their ships, and especially some of how easy some of their missions are after you get past the dilemmas, it makes up for that. And finally, the Borg. You don't mix anybody with the Borg, unless you're assimilating personnel from other affiliations of your opponent. Borg is Borg. Leave the Borg alone. Don't mix anything with them. They don't care anyways. Borg is so powerful on its own, you don't need to complement it with anything. The drones that you have available are enough. That's all for today. Have a great day, everybody.